You want to. It's not stuff like that. All right, so today's lesson's on evolution in action. And the highlight of this lesson are going to be the highlights are going to be the peppered moth and bacteria. So the peppered moth, sometimes referred to as Darwin's moth, because it so nicely illustrates the process of evolution. So what happens with the peppered moth? The peppered moth, for many hundreds or millions, I don't know how old this creature is, but I mean as a species, but was this peppered moth, and the birds would be able to eat it if they could find it. But the peppering was a camouflage, which made it harder for the birds to find it. Then came along what we call the Revolution. Industrial Revolution is now about 200 years ago started. Um, the main features of the Industrial Revolution is burning a lot of coal and other fossil fuels to power industry. Now, in industrial countries like the United States and much of Europe, what that resulted in is kind of dirty air with black smoke everywhere. And the black smoke settled on a lot of buildings and trees. Became a bit of an issue in the 1970s, and the United States government actually, President Nixon passed the Clean Air Act. Sterling, what's your question?
So you said that the moths like put off like black stuff, those at least on everything.
No, the black stuff came from the factories. The
Oh,
factories spewing out dirty dust and soot out into the air. And so what then happened is, because um, uh, the moths started out as peppered, a few of the moths had a random mutation. A mutation is when, we've talked about this a little bit, but a mutation is going to be when some of the genes or one of the genes is going to be changed by whatever. And some of these random mutations caused that the moths became a black color. So there were a few black moths. Well, then what happened was the peppered moths were getting eaten and the black moths weren't. And that's because the birds couldn't see the black moths as well. You see in the bird's mouth there's a peppered moth. And so as a result of that, almost all of the moths became a black color. Then we had the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act meant that it was then illegal for big companies to have their factories without having scrubbers in the scrubber would clean the air before it came out into the atmosphere. And so that became mandated by law, so that we didn't get very well. There was two things they didn't want. They didn't want all the soot, and the other thing they didn't want is all the acid causing oxides, which were nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides. And it's still there, but it's not as bad as it used to be. But anyways, the trees became cleaner and the black moths all disappeared, and we got back to our peppered moth. Now, the way that happened is that some of the black moths had a mutation which made them peppered. All the black moths got eaten by the birds, and the peppered moths were left behind. So that is evolution, or it's actually the process of natural selection at work. And we got another example of that, which is what we call resistant bacteria. This is a real problem for us as humans. Now, why it's a real problem is because for only the last 100 and so years, we've had these antibiotics, which have been able to uh, control infections that we get after, for example, wounds. That it was a big problem, actually. For example, in World War I, more people died from wounds than from actually, yeah, after the fact, like days later. You'd get shot and then you'd die 3 days later because of the infection. It wasn't actually the wound that killed you, it's the infection. When they discovered penicillin and other drugs like that, penicillin is a naturally occurring drug that comes from a fungus. When they discovered that, the mortality rate of people who are wounded dropped hugely. And so you could take people from the battlefield who had all kinds of terrible wounds. You could give them an antibiotic and they wouldn't get infected, and they would then recover and live. And that's the case nowadays. Now, the problem is that with a lot of antibiotics, people will take the antibiotic until the symptoms go away. And so the typical symptom that you're treating with an antibiotic is going to be an inflammation and pain and soreness. Heat, you're going to have an area which is infected with bacteria. It'll be hot. and it'll be red and sore. And people take the antibiotic, and typically what would happen is people would take the antibiotic and it would, as soon as they stopped being sore and red, they would stop taking it, saying, I don't need it anymore. Now, when you go and get an antibiotic from your doctor, the doctor will say, take them all, take it until the course is finished. Now, why? When the redness and the soreness has gone away, you've probably killed 90% of the bacteria, but some of them you haven't killed. Okay. And if you don't kill 99, you're never going to kill them all. But if you don't kill a lot more than 99%, you don't kill 99.99999%, then what will happen is you have a risk of a reinfection, and the bacteria that are going to be left behind and infect you, they're going to be resistant to that antibiotic. So then if you take the antibiotic, it might not work. And so that's a problem for the world, because our antibiotic drugs become less effective. Yeah. And they don't work like they used to work. And then we have to go and find new antibiotic drugs. Luckily, nowadays we have some chemistry and biology that allows us to create drugs, but it is a bit of a worry. Last slide I'm going to show you about evidence for evolution is this idea of shared anatomy, or shared structures, or they're called here homologous structures. What we see here is limbs, the forelimbs of three different animals. One is a human, and so we see the hands there, pretty obvious. One is a bat, and one is a whale. Now, what you'll notice is the color coding. So our what do you call that? That's the humerus, is the big green bone. And you see that the bats and the whales have a bone which seems to be a different shape, but its relation to the other bones is the same. And the same with this radius and ulnus. Ulna and radius, same for that. Now, the whale bone, they're more close together and more solid, and that's because you need a very strong structure to be a whale swimming in the water. But look, it looks like the whale's got a hand. Did you ever see a whale with a hand? No, because what's happening with the whale is this all going to be covered with some tissues in the form of a fin. And likewise with the bat, the bat hand is not so obvious, but you can see sort of like some fingers and stuff there. And that's to indicate that we all sort of developed from some common ancestor that had sort of five fingery things or whatever. Another evidence of evolution is in our embryos. So embryos of all of we'll call them chordates or vertebrates, they have at different phases when they're very, very young, they all seem to be the same. So a human embryo looks like a fish embryo. And actually, there are some people that did a lot of study on, they would just look at embryology as a way of doing study of evolution. And yeah, so lastly, and perhaps the best evidence that we have of evolution nowadays is through our this represents family trees, or we could say our way of categorizing animals and plants. And what we find is that the very base of this kind of understanding, there is some DNA that all of us share. So in other words, we share some DNA with big mammals. We share some DNA with fungus and plants and bacteria. We share more DNA with big mammals than we do with them. All right. And actually, our DNA with primates, we share a lot more DNA than we share with other mammals. And if you take your DNA and your brother's DNA, the match will be very, very close. Like that'd be like the closest match you could get. And that's how we do DNA family tree stuff. Is you can look at DNA and see the similarities. Yes, Sterling has another question.
So are these all connected, bacteria, plants, fungi, and animals?
Very good question. And the answer is yes, they are. That is at the very simplest level, we all have some DNA that we share. And so that DNA might be used to produce mitochondria, for example. I mean, like almost all living things except for viruses have mitochondria, which are used to produce energy from sugars and things. Anyway, so the idea of this chapter, and I'll just summarize it now, was that there are many evidences of evolution in our that we can observe. Modern evidences, resistant bacteria, the peppered moth, but also now that we have DNA testing, we can see there the similarity between DNA and is more similar with more closely related things. And so we can see that, for example, we're pretty closely related to chimpanzees. Our DNA is more similar to chimpanzee than to any other animal. And then the other thing there is that our body structures have similar things. Yes, Sterling, another question.
Why are we all similar to just chimpanzees? Why not any other one?
Chimpanzees and bonobos. So the reason why we're more similar to them than to other animals, the evolutionary biologists would say the reason for that is because we have a common ancestor. So something like, and I guess it would be 3 or 4 million years ago, there was a creature living that probably looked more like a chimpanzee than it did like a human. But it had offspring, some of which developed into the line that became chimpanzees, and some of which developed into something that walked on 2 legs, still looked a bit like a chimpanzee, and then started looking more and more like a human after a few million years. And this is pretty well recorded amongst sort of archaeology. That's not right, the right word. Paleontologists who study fossil record. If you there's an area in Africa between it's called the Rift Valley area, but it's sort of south of Sudan and north of Lake Victoria, Uganda area, the Rift Valley area, that they found fossils of animals that walked on 2 legs like humans and had hands and feet like humans. So they found the full skulls of these. I mean, the full skeletons of these, and but their heads were more like a chimpanzee. And so the first one like that, they call them hominids because they're like humans. And the first one was found by this guy name of Art Leakey. He is a paleontologist, and he called it Lucy because they were able to determine that this fossil was a female, getting a full skeleton. And you see the skull and the hands and feet, right? And this is something that looks like a human, except it looks a little bit like a chimpanzee.
They're all the same, right?
They were what?
They look all the same.
No, just like humans don't all look the same. I mean, there would be some tall, some short, some
structures, right?
yeah. Well, yes, they were a species, and so none of them would have looked like us. They wouldn't have the same head size. Any other questions? So good questions so far. Appreciate it. All right. So what I'm going to do now, guys, is I will wait.